Brenda to introduce her panel. And also mention, mute your cell phones if you have any noise devices, mute them now. And tonight, in the second row is Shannon, and it's her birthday, and this is her event of the day.
Thank you. Oh, God.
Should we sing happy birthday to you?
Oh, somebody already did. You don't have to. I got sung to by 5-year-olds, so I'm going to do it on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you for coming out after torrential rains. And you had a hailstorm, yes?
Mm-hmm.
Last night we were having class, and Laura was there, and we had a car skid out and wipe out 2 of my students' cars. So I'm grateful that we're all here safe and sound. And think of some questions that you might have for me and for my wonderful panel. Laura Foreman, who is a fiction writer, and she's working on a trilogy. She'll explain a little bit more about that. And Susan James, who is in my morning class with Steve, who's on the end. And she is working on a book about her 10 years of hospice working. And it's not Death for Dummies. It's a really profound, soulful book. Steve is a wonderful saxophonist and musician, and he is working on memoir as well as biography, and he's a jazz critic. So they've been studying with me for a while, and I'm really happy to bring them out with me, and I've been having these memoir panels at every one of my readings, and they're just much more interesting than just me alone, I think. So, how many of you are writing memoir? Excellent. So, Laura, would you pass this out? This is 10 tips to successful memoir. It's gleaned from the book, Your Life is a Book, How to Craft and Publish Your Memoir. And we are very thrilled that Oprah.com chose this book for her fall list of books. So that's been quite a wonderful boon. It's like, thank you, thank you. There's a wonderful sense about this book. Even as we were beginning to write it, my co-author is my literary agent, Sarah Jane Freeman, in New York City. And as we were writing this book, we realized that we both felt that memoir is transformative, that anyone who is writing memoir looks at their life, has this kind of interesting, mature narrator looking back at the younger self, and the epiphanies, the self-discovery, the transformation that comes from that is extraordinary. And so even if you don't publish your memoir, even if it's just a legacy for your children, for your family and friends, my question to everyone as I'm going around is, what do we possess if not our stories? At the end of your life, one of the things that I've talked about with Susan is that they want to tell their stories. They want someone to listen as they are making that great passage into the next. And what do they have? It doesn't matter that they are world famous or that they have lots of money. It matters that they have their story. So I am thrilled that Oprah saw that in this book and chose it. We've been anointed by Oprah, and I'm very grateful because I really have great respect for the life that she's led and the help that she offers to others. So you'll see on the back of the page, I picked up from Oprah some of the quotes, some of the writing prompts that run all the way through this book. The writing prompts are meant to help you get started, and as we go through chapter by chapter, they get more and more, I wouldn't say difficult, but more and more profound. They're not simple questions. They're not something like, what do you think about your father? They're things like, now that you've survived abuse, scandal, divorce, illness, betrayal, what do you have to teach? What do you know about yourself that you then have to give to others? Because that's the payoff for any memoir. How many of you are realizing that you are the main character of your memoir.
Sure.
Good, you figured that out, so you're ahead of me. I wrote a whole memoir called Build Me an Ark, A Life with Animals, and I thought the animals were the main characters until my editor told me, no, you have to grow and change. You are the main character. So there's a little trick that I teach my students called sidestepping the self. And that is a way that you can be generous and really help other people become you, become the doorway that you are in your story. So the question you ask is, who am I in this story? Who am I in this story of internment camps, of working with hospice, of being part of the tradition that was the Cherokees who were removed during the great removal of the Trail of Tears, as with Laura? Who am I in this story as a young saxophonist discovering Joe Brazil as Steve? Who am I in this story? And when you have the answer to that, you will have the beginning of the plot, which is the evolution of the self through time. The evolution of the self through time is the plot. So how do you get yourself on the page? Every fiction writer knows that you have to create a character of yourself. You can't just say I, because who is I? So this technique called sidestepping the self, let me read you a little bit. Those of you who have the book, it's page 53. In memoir, it is usually the first person or I who narrates the story. In the same way an actor will create a character for the stage, you can craft a character of yourself on the page. But remember that you as the writer are slightly detached and distinct from the I on the page. That person is not exactly you, with all of your secrets exposed, but someone who is carefully reconstructed, a replica of you, a mini you. A person who is a lot like you, but another creature altogether. A sympathetic and fully realized companion, an artfully portrayed character who is you but not all of you. So Steve, you remember in that morning class when we were dealing with a person who was writing about the death of her husband, and it came up that she had had an abortion. So the big class discussion was, is that abortion essential to the evolution of the character? Is that essential to the story? And we decided it was not. So she was able to hold that secret and private. And the minute she found something that she could hold sacred and secret and private and confidential, she was able to be more generous about herself on the page. It's kind of a weird little sidestepping where you say, that's me, but not all of me. That's me, the carefully constructed me who's on the page. But it's not me completely splayed out on the page. And once you can do that, you have this kind of mature narrator who can stand and look back at the younger self with great compassion, even forgiveness and understanding. Because you'll say, that was my younger self. And now I'm at this stage where I can see my flaws, I can see my mistakes, I do not judge them. You really don't want to be self-flagellating, you don't want to be self-loathing, because the reader is becoming you. The reader is becoming you, and the reader doesn't like to be self-loathing. The reader likes to feel him or herself as having integrity and promise, and they then become you with this kind of fond detachment toward yourself. Is this making sense to everyone? Yes, yes. When you get that kind of voice, that mature narrator saying, when I look back and see the mistake I made in my marriage, the reader trusts you because they know that you've processed the pain. I have a whole section here on processed pain, because anyone in my class will tell you there are times when I have to turn and say, I'm sorry, this is not processed pain. This is just raw pain on the page. And it's not anything I can learn from, because it's just, blah, I got hurt, I got hurt, I got hurt. It's a one-note samba, what Sarah Jane calls the misery memoir. It doesn't mean that you can't write about things that have been horrifying or harrowing, but it means you have to write from this point of view of looking at the self as a character and showing your own foibles and looking without judgment, like the great 19th century narrators like Tolstoy, like Dickens, although Dickens is a little judgmental of his villains. But I would say the wonderful George Eliot, Flaubert, Balzac, Tolstoy, when they look at their heroes and heroines, they do not judge, even the villains. So judgment of self is really not necessary on the page. It doesn't mean that you can't be a villain or that you can't do horrible things, but it means that you have a sense of looking at that self with compassion and understanding. It's what we call writing with the eye of God. I'll read you a little bit about that. I love that phrase. Sarah Jane came up with it, and I really love it. Sometimes it's not enough just to write from our own opinionated viewpoint. Sometimes we need a larger vision and a more generous understanding to look with compassion and understanding at our own life and the lives of those around us. We call this writing with the eye of God. But beyond stepping outside of yourself to better portray your character, going to the next step is imagining another's point of view, right? Because along with yourself as a main character, there will be other characters, your family, your mate, people who were there with you on a travel memoir or a spiritual journey, and you have to create them as characters on the page. So that's the next step in characterization, character of the other. We were just talking about that at dinner tonight, creating a character of the other. As a philosophical and spiritual exercise, imagine that everyone in your memoir is equal to you. Every other character's story is as valid and valuable as your own. You just happen to be the one who's telling it. You might be a hero in your own life story, but a villain in another person's memoir. I know that's probably true for me. Try to intuit others' fears and motivations. Even write some scenes in which you imagine to be the character other than yourself. This expansiveness will help you to create real flawed characters for whom the reader has as much empathy as you do. This equanimity and more spacious pose is a good spiritual practice to keep in mind. An anonymous quote that Sarah Jane loves is, "All things observed long enough turn to good." All things observed long enough turn to good. I'm going to read just a short clip from my recent memoir, I Want to Be Left Behind. And it was really a fascinating journey to write this. It's a dark comedy of faith and family. And there's a chapter in here where my father took us on a mandatory Caribbean cruise. And I did not know if I would survive, but I did, to tell the story. And my family are conservative, from moderate to far right, conservative Christian Southern Baptist. And many of them say things like, there are no drowning polar bears and shrinking ice caps where I'm going. Right? So that's what I'm dealing with as a nature writer, as a National Geographic author. So we're there at the mandatory suppers on the cruise ship, so there is no escape unless I could get a lifeboat, in the middle of the Caribbean. And we bring up global warming. I did not bring it up. Somebody brought it up. And there we went into a long debate. And my brother and I are very close, so he was trying to kind of protect me a little bit. He's in the military, so it's his tendency. I finally snapped with all of the doubt and denial of global warming. And I said, If you still doubt global warming evidence, then you're just in denial. Hey, Beba, my brother tried to toss me a life preserver. Did you ever see that greeting card? I'm not living in denial, I'm just visiting. And then here's the couple of sentences which were for me writing from the eye of God and looking outside myself at how another might see me. In fact, those in my family who have suffered with my little lectures about global warming and environment who do not see eye to eye with me. Sometimes I imagine families as a kind of Olympics in which everyone has an event. Always the subtle competition, the power struggles, the rivalries and shifting alliances. While I may think my family's event is synchronized swim, they probably see me as a lonely, long-distance runner, probably running in the wrong direction. Yes, I hear the laughs, yes. So that's what happened when I got outside of myself. And I really want to involve my students in this discussion. We have these kinds of conversations all the time. And ask them, how was it for you to write a memoir in which you had to create characters of the other? Remove that. And I'll hand you the microphone. Yes? So you can hear. Laura? There you go.
Well, mine has been a long journey. I've done a good bit of memoir writing, and Brenda is absolutely correct in speaking about the process of pain, that to find that knife edge of walking to bearing witness what happened, but finding the self that's resilient and, if possible, the humor. I believe, a woman I know once said, well, the difference between comedy and tragedy is 5 years. So it's kind of like what Sarah Jane said, if you look at it long enough, it's funny, you know. For me, I really had to get a big distance to do the real work of memoir and actually create fiction. There was so much that wasn't known for the story that I wanted to tell, so much that was kept secret and hidden that wasn't going to be revealed, that I finally I was trying to write a memoir, but it was all, I don't know this, I don't know that, I don't know this, I don't know that. So, and yet I was driven to try to write about this, so I made the decision to go to fiction. And Rilla Askew, who is a wonderful writer, recently said at a conference, when I write memoir about my family, I lie. When I write fiction about my family, I tell the truth. So that really bolstered me up. My story is, the book that I'm working on is a historical novel. It's about the Cherokee who were left behind in North Carolina after the removal. And those are my people on my mother's side. And that has just been tamped down, and we don't talk about that, and yet it's written all over their faces. On my mother's side of the family, it's very strong features. Additionally, I discovered that they did also enslave people of African descent. So that had to be included. So I'm weaving in what's history I do know that's accurate in terms of my family, but I made the commitment to really write the history of the time to try to understand why those people in my family and around them made the decisions that they made, the betrayals and the choices. And this is the doorway that I've walked through. So I guess I'm the witness for the different doors to memoir.
But could you say something about she had a sense of something, a big family secret about her father when she was writing memoir and her novel, and what you discovered?
Yeah, it was actually after my dad died, because there were all these things I couldn't talk about, and yet I had this, just something's wrong here. And after my dad died, I discovered that he had a brother, had a half-brother, and that my grandfather had raped a woman, had raped a young girl who was probably 14 or 15, who he had hired to help my grandmother while she was expecting their third child. And,
A slave?
And he wasn't a slave. She wasn't a slave. She was African American. This was after slavery. But, you know, it was during Jim Crow. So again, it's not a lot of difference. I'm very clear about that. But that man had died, but he grew up to be the first deputy sheriff, first African American deputy sheriff in the next town over. He grew up just down the road, half a mile away, and I've met his 4 children, and they're my first cousins, and we're really working on the healing. So I wouldn't have found that out. I wouldn't have had the courage to keep pushing towards that had I not allowed myself to walk through the fiction step by step. And I've done research, I've done genealogy, and there's a lot. The story of my family is really the story of American history. And my mother's people came, I tracked them back to the 1600s. So the European side has been here a long time, and they've wreaked a lot of havoc in their course of their years. So I think it's a viable path to allow yourself to go back and forth between fiction. When the memoir gets too difficult, allow yourself to go to fiction. When the fiction, when you're ready, then go back to memoir. And I am working on memoir also of this, but it was only through the door of fiction that I could access the memoir.
Absolutely.
I'm not going to do it.
Does it reach, you know
Well,
what?
we changed seats. We'll just change that one.
Changing seats.
Yes.
So I'm writing a memoir about my work in hospice.